Okay, we had a question about how do I create a UI that uses a control like a repeater to show local data in memory. So not necessarily bound to a ThingWorx service, but bound to in-memory JavaScript data. And importantly, to include an image. And you'll see why this is important in a minute, because it's not obvious how to get an image to bind to local data. So we're going to show this example here, and it's a very, very simple example. I've got a scene here, you can see, with just a target and a model. We're going to start with obviously wanting to show a repeater, so to do that I'm just going to use a pop-up which we'll make visible, and in this pop-up I'm going to create a repeater. And a repeater, you can put any content in, so I'm going to use a grid to define its layout, and that grid I'm going to have two columns. The first column I'm going to use a label, and normally you can set the content of an item to be based on the item of the row. So let's have item.name. So this will basically say, given this row, given the item that is this row, take the name property and show it in the label. And this works for many of the other controls where you have kind of bindable content. Where it's not so obvious is when you use an image, because image has no way of defining the source, for example, the actual image, as this kind of syntax. So how do I bind a property and a field, which is a row of an array, which changes every row of the array, to the image? It's not obvious at all. Now, one thought is, of course, if it's a bindable source, well, I could create something. I could create, let's have a property called image here, a parameter, and I could bind that to here. So this is kind of the effect I want. I want to bind the source to an expression, but how do I make that be item.name? I can't edit the binding here. But let's have a look at what would happen. I mean, if I just created this as a static thing, let's just make it an image. I've got an image here in my resources. What this means is that now this property is bound to all the images in the table. So if I have a table with 10 images, they're actually all going to be the same image because it's bound to one value. So let's at least show that that works. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to just bring in some data that I've created. And let's just talk through what this does. So this basically creates an array, and the array is going to be two values. One is called hello world, and it's going to show Earth day, and one called goodnight world, which is going to show Earth night. So there's two rows to my array, and I want to bind that at runtime to the repeater. So I'm going to need to first of all give the repeater a name called photo list. So this is where my photos are going to arrive in this repeater, and we're going to call that when we're ready, and we're going to put ready into the spatial target. So I've probably already done that. So when the target tracking starts, this will call ready. Ready will bind the list to the bind my data to the list, and we should see this list appear. Now what we will see is the names. What we won't see the images, because what we're actually going to see is going to be this property repeated for each image. And let's just we'll just have the image height. Let's just fix this to be 128 pixels, just to keep it under control. So let's now preview that and see what happens. So we track. We get the tracking event, and you can see now we've got hello world, we've got goodnight world, so that's the data coming from the array, but we get the same image. So the image that's in the array doesn't get used because we're actually bound to something else. So how might we fix that? Well, it so happens that when you actually look at the binding, let's look at that binding, it says, grab app.params image. If you look at this one, This is effectively the binding. Item.name. So what I want is to somehow get item.image here. There's no way of editing this in Studio, in the editor. However, if we go and look at the project and we look at the source phone, which components, which is where the pages are actually managed, and we look, we have home.js, which is the JavaScript that you saw in the editor, and we've got home.json. This is the semantic definition of it, so this is the UI. Let's edit this file. Now, to do this safely, we're going to just exit that procedure for a second, exit the experience, I should say. Open this up in an editor, and we're going to look for that that property that we bound to the widget. Okay, if you remember, if we go back in here and just open it up again so you can see it, we had called the parameter image. So there's an app parameter here called image that we had bound to the photo. So here it is here inside the definition. So this is the definition of the UI. Inside here you can see we have a column, and the column contains an image, and the image is data bound to app_params image. So here's the trick. We can edit this. We can say item.image. So now it's bound to item.image. Now, the way that these expressions work is that they basically just try and resolve whatever this is in scope. So basically, the JavaScript is going to ask the runtime, what is item.image in the current scope. And we will see that when we save that, close that file, go back into here. Let's first of all look at our repeater. We'll see it now says item.image, and we'll run the preview. And now we see, instead of the static image, we now get the day picture for the first one, the night picture for the second one. So we are now bound to the content of this array. Alright, let's take it a step further. Let's go and make it dynamic. So let's just bring in another little bit of code. So we've got screenshots. This is using the underlying screenshot API, which is the base of the camera widget. So this will take a screenshot. So when we, in this case, press a button, we're going to go call screenshot. When that finishes, this calls a function that we define, called, in this case, callback, which delivers us the image as a base64 string. And what we're going to do is we're going to add it to the array. So we take my repeater and we're going to push a new row onto the array. We could have a field that collects the name of the image. I'm just going to actually put the current time in there. But you can see that we form the image basically as a data URL. So it's data image ping base64, and then the string that we're getting back from the camera. So now, when we look at the, we have a button here on the screen. This should say screenshot. So this should take the photo. Taking the photo should add to our array in the view. What we're just going to do here is we're just going to make this pop up non-centered, and we're going to just arrange it to be anchored to the left of the screen, just so we can actually see things a bit better. And we're going to make it, let's have it a bit smaller. We'll have it 50% wide, and we'll have it about 70% high, so we can actually see what's going on. So there's our pop-up. So let's run and see what happens. So we start with two things in the world. Obviously you can't see the screen because this pop-up's in the way, but let's now take a photo. You see that we dynamically added the array. The array picked up the value and added it, and we can keep doing that, and we can keep doing that. And you can see that the list now dynamically increments. So this is now a reflection of the dynamic array that we had created originally, plus each of the values that are added every time that we took a photograph. And of course that data's in memory, so you can choose to do what you want to do with this. If you want to send this off to ThingWorx or whatever, you can do that, because the data is now in local application scope. So that's how you bind something like an image to array data, is that you bind it to, for example, an application property, and then you change the binding by editing the actual UI definition behind the scenes. Not pretty, but it works. And that's the end of this demo.